And we are recording episode 2 of the Story of Atonement, where I basically talk about and go back with my final thoughts and everything throughout my career and all that. And I think the best title for this episode would be Chaotic Ego, because, and I'm not saying that because I'm referring to Billy, though that is part of it, but some of it also has to do with how much craziness happened throughout the past, I don't know, 6 to 10 months or whatnot, after the whole retirement stuff from CWA. So I have a little bit of time, so I might as well be able to get episode 2 out of the way now. Keep in mind, this episode, along with the beginning of the next episode, might be a little controversial in my opinions, but again, it's a different time period, so a lot of this is my initial thoughts and how I felt about everything back in the day and how I feel about, today and all that stuff. So keep that in mind. And I know there was some of the stuff here that Steve and I have, disagreed with over the years and all that stuff, but, you can agree to disagree on some of those things. But anyway, let's get back into it. So I'm officially gone from CWA, and literally, CWA literally falls apart after I leave. And I don't think that's the reasoning behind it. Personally, in my opinion, I think CWA ended once Daniel left, because there was no backup plan for once Daniel left. And I think that was the start of how CWA would fall once he left. But anyways, they rebranded PGW. I didn't like it at first. I thought it was stupid. Completely, that was a dumb idea or take of mine back in the day. Because ultimately it all worked out. I didn't like the idea of people keeping their names. Everybody was supposedly going to change their names, but most of us didn't. Some people benefited, like Bailey with Al Sahim to Genesis, and Apollo to Chris Reckless, Jackson Brooks to Jackson, and then Jackson back to Jackson Brooks. George Deming to Sean Deming, which, no offense. I love George, but the name didn't work for him with that. So there were a few odds and ends that I thought did not work, personally. And then, I'm just working with Steven with some creative ideas to kind of figure out what to do and all that stuff. Since I'm no longer involved on screen, besides Bob Humper stuff, I figured let's kind of, see what we could do with all this stuff. Because again, like I mentioned, it was a good thing that I left the way I did, ultimately, also because of how violent that I became, which was one of the reasons why I didn't really like PGW at first. And I get involved in all this stuff, and then we get towards the summer, and then he starts talking to me about doing one more match. It's such a cliche at this point, but we do the one more match thing, or he brings it up to me and all this stuff. And then ultimately, whenever I say everybody wants me back, by that, I don't mean the fans. I'm talking about the main roster. At this point, we're already, I think, like 6 months or so, out since then, and there's a lot of people that wanted me to come back on the roster to do some matches and all this stuff. And it got to the point where I had nothing going on, and the stuff with the family stuff cooled down. I realized there's some new names and all that stuff, and we start talking. So this is around the middle of the Renaissance period, and the discussion behind the scenes was having me versus Billy for the main event of Missionary 30, where ultimately I would go over against Billy. So that was the plan, and then a lot of stuff backfired with the whole Renaissance thing. Everybody knows about the infamous PP Stomp, which in my opinion to this day is the most watched clip, or it's the most memorable moment, I hate to say, in PGW history, because it had a long-lasting effect of what would become, you know what I'm talking about. Sorry, I kind of lost track of where I was at with all this. So there we go. So ultimately, it's the most basically it's the most infamous moment in PGW history, because it had a long-lasting effect of what would be to come with a lot of stuff that happens later on, like a butterfly effect. But I don't know if it was in a good way or in a bad way. So this gets canned ultimately, and Steven kind of says, let's just do me and you one more time. And I said, okay. Now, ultimately, at this point, when the idea was discussed, the plan was for Steven to win. And I think a lot of that had to do with the story, which made sense. Because, again, the Renaissance was kind of built on the foundation of the Enlightenment. Which, honestly, I never really went into detail in the last episode about it. But basically, the Enlightenment was basically a faction of Ryan's idea that Steven basically made it into his own in terms of putting people into the faction, even though it was Ryan's idea. Ultimately, Ryan hated the idea, especially with me being involved, and these people would be involved. It's like me, Sheik, Mysterion, Akumu, George the Butcher, Nathan, Lunatic, Nova, a lot of these people would join all this stuff and then no longer turn into Ryan's faction. And then he left, and then I took it over, It was a complete train wreck of a faction that I tried to make work, but it didn't really work that well throughout the winter. But that's kind of how that happened. Anyway, so we get to that, and before, we do some stuff on screen with me, we do some backstage stuff with me and Leatherface and a confrontation with Imperius during the Q&A. We do a few odds and ends and all this stuff, and then Steven initially to get me on the screen. For me accepting the offer to do this match or whatnot, one of the conditions he had for me was he wanted to do a Hall of Fame. Now, everybody knows at this point of the amount of people that are in the Hall of Fame, which to me personally, I think the Hall of Fame is... I think there's too many people in the Hall of Fame, but a lot of people deserve it. That's why I like the Class of the Goats now. But he initially pitched me as the first inductee, and we used that as a catalyst to get to this match, where ultimately I have my speech, go into the Hall of Fame, and then basically say that I will have one more match. So basically my revenge was against Spears for, ending me back in CWA, and how the whole Renaissance thing was going. Because it's like, you're destroying Scorpion's legacy with this whole Renaissance thing, with the whole Leatherface thing, turning back into Beerus, That's kind of where the catalyst of the story went. And it made sense. The story made sense compared to the match of me and Billy or whatnot. Because we did do a match practice-wise, and before that was one of the other reasons why the match was canned, because the practice match was not good. So we kind of shipped can for that, and ultimately, like I said, the PP stomp. So we get to Missionary 29, and we do this confrontation where Steven destroys me. We do that, and then ultimately, after 29, we go through an issue. So, and this affects the rest of this run, unfortunately, in my opinion, where some stuff happens behind the scenes drama-wise in relation to Billy and Bailey and all this stuff. And in my opinion, ultimately, I think a lot of fans turned on this run because of the issues in relation to Billy and Bailey. Because again, everybody wanted me back, but then all of a sudden, it just takes a huge negative reaction, which honestly has never been seen before on the channel or whatnot. And it was not a good look, but we ultimately went through with all these plans regardless, with the amount of dislikes and the comments on all these videos. I'm still convinced to this day that there might have been some people spam disliking those videos. I don't know who would do that personally, but that's just a thought of mine. But a lot of the issues of Billy and Bailey off screen kind of resonated with me, and I kind of got thrown into the situation that I was never involved in, unfortunately, and I think it had a long-lasting effect in terms of how this run went. So we do this no-holds-barred tag team match where ultimately the plan was for me and Diablo to go up against Nick and Steven. This was a pitched match because ultimately we knew I was losing, so this would have been like the, compensation to, get a win under my belt. And on top of that, do, a interaction with me and Nick and do some wrestling, which we did pretty good in the match, me and Nick. It was a very good tag team match. We used to joke back in the day about how I didn't do many tag team matches back, in CWA, and all of a sudden doing these tag matches, they turned out to be classics. So ultimately we shoehorned Greg in there because they were supposed to do a match, which ended up never happening at 30, but that's what happened. So I win there, and then we get to Missionary 30. So before we get to Missionary 30, there's another person that's involved in this match, and that person is George. So the idea 29 was for Brandon, and I'll be honest with you guys, I don't know why I thought this was a good idea. The plan was for Brandon, as Raven, to be the special guest referee of this match. He bails last second. I threw a hissy fit, called George, and said, hey, can you be the referee for this match? And he said, absolutely. So, again, that made more storyline sense because, again, I don't know why Raven would want to be a referee in this kind of situation unless it's to get, like, some sort of revenge on Beerus, looking back. But basically, Brandon, bailed, chickened out, whatever you want to call it. And this would have been multiple occasions where Brandon would have the tendency to bail last sec, which did not resonate very well with a lot of the people here, especially Chris, with the 41 match. So we get George on board with this whole storyline thing, and again, with the whole negative reaction, it just made the whole situation worse. But we get to Missionary 30, and last second, there was a plan. I think they were going to do the Renaissance versus LDK. Ultimately, everybody knows the amount of issues and the no-shows that happened, so it turned into the Renaissance versus the Enlightenment as a one-time thing or whatnot. So we have George. We ultimately get George to agree to wrestle today and also get me to do another match. And I don't look on this match as fondly because of some things that happened with me during the match, but it was still a good match overall. What happened during the match was, first of all, Chris gets hit in the face during his entrance by a stick by Ed. 2, unfortunately, George and I both got injured in this match briefly. I can't remember specifically how George got injured, but this would have been around the time where Nick, as cryptic as I run as, was a bit reckless in the ring. And there was a spot in the match, from my memory serves me right, you know how a wrestler as a babyface does, their comeback, or what do you like to call it. I get tagged in, and I hit like a clothesline. Nick gets back up and immediately just starts attacking me. I don't know what Nick was thinking, or if there was some sort of miscommunication, but all of a sudden Nick's just going full-blown, full force, attacking me. Like, not like attacking me on camera, but like, he basically like sabotaged the whole comeback, and it looked very nasty and bad. And then ultimately he does some sort of bear hug move or whatnot, into like a helicopter face plant thing onto me or whatnot, and I fall on my shoulder, and he throws me into this bear hug on the ground, and you can hear me gasping for air and all this stuff, where I don't know if it was the landing on the shoulder thing or me trying to, gasp for air, but you can see that I was completely, winded. And that was the catalyst of, Nick, ultimately going on a reckless spree when it came to some of the stuff with Ed and, George getting hurt also in the match. And then most infamous stuff with Chris at Resurrection, which ultimately he dropped the world title via vacancy. So it didn't mesh well. And that was one of the 2 times that I wrestled with Nick where it just didn't turn out well. The other one happened on the road to Endgame, which I'll, again, elaborate on that once we get to the HFW stuff. But wrestling Nick is like a hit or a miss. He is known to be one of the most reckless wrestlers we've had, but he can also be safe and do some things. But sometimes Nick can get a little carried away and get a little into it or crazy, you can say the least. I love Nick, I do, but he's probably the second most least favorite wrestler that I enjoyed wrestling behind Ryan for these reasons alone. And again, it made me nervous sometimes to wrestle Nick after the whole 30 tag. So this happened, and then we get to the match at Missionary 30, which in my opinion is a copy and paste match from Final Judgment 2. Steven's never watched the match, unfortunately, because of the whole video deletions, but ultimately it was a finisher spree type of match with some technicality involved. So we wanted to kind of incorporate some stuff from the Daniel match from Final Judgment, which it did work. So we did that, but there was way too many finisher kickouts. A lot of false finishes, and there was a spot in the match where ultimately Scorpion actually got the pedigree on Beers and actually got the 3 count. It was an unscripted planned spot that happened where, oh my god, Scorpion just pinned Beers, but George is down. Which, I love that spot. I really did. But ultimately, I remember it took at least 2 F5s and like 3 pedigrees, something like that, to win the match for Beers. And I liked how this match went. Like, there was a nice, gigantic spine buster in that match. I hit my first super kick in this match. Like, it was a very good, singles match overall. Just a little bit too many kickouts or whatnot. Which, honestly, I liked the catalyst of George being involved because it would continue indirectly from the storyline perspective going into Missionary 40 with the end of childhood. And, Scorpion, aligning with, Beerus and all that stuff. And blaming George for a lot of things, including Missionary 30 and not being, there for me when I needed him the most from a childhood perspective and being able to help me out. So it did good for long-term storylines for me and George or whatnot to start off that feud, even if it was indirect. Now, overall with Missionary 30, Steven and I have kind of went back and forth with this over the years. It should have main evented, in my opinion, me and Steven, even though the way I looked at it was the original Missionary 30 main event was Chris and Diablo, I believe, for the Warriors title. But then a lot of stuff happened with Diablo, and I don't know if I should say this on camera or not, but he contracted an STD or something like that, supposedly, and that's why he did not wrestle 30, whereas there was many other wrestlers, like Maniac, he couldn't make it because of some sort of water pipe leak or something like that. Nick, I don't remember. Bailey, it was something to do, I think, with the whole Billy situation. Like, there was a lot of no-shows for multiple reasons, and those were some of the reasonings. And unfortunately, because there's a not a good roster at that time for Missionary 30, there was a lot of, what we like to call back in the day, friendly competition where members of a faction would wrestle each other because there wasn't many people around to do matches. So like No Holds Barred 13 and one where I did the tag team match. The main event was Chris Reckless versus Cryptic for the world title. Made zero sense, but again, with the depleted roster, it was necessary. Whereas Missionary 30, the main event was Chris Reckless versus Beers for the Warriors title. Again, completely unnecessary because there was no build. But again, it was a depleted roster at the time, so there was no other choice. The reason why I say at the time me and Steven should have main evented is the way I look at it back then is, yes, I did not deserve the main event spot because I was only a part-timer. So, like, why would you want to shoehorn a part-timer into a match? Like, it's not WWE where Goldberg's back, main event. The Rock is back, main event. John Cena is back, main event. But the way I looked at it was, out of all the matches that are remaining, pretty much every match outside of the Royal Rumble changed. And that left one match with build, and that was me and Steven. So why would a match that has the most build now up to that point be like semi-main or middle of the card? It made no sense to me back in the day, and it still doesn't. But at this point, that's something that Steven and I have argued over the years and disagreed with. But like, there's no point, or I'm not upset about it. There's just nothing to be upset about because the videos no longer exist. Everything from CWA within the first 2 years, including PGW, no longer exists up until Missionary 30. So what's there to be upset about when these videos no longer exist? So overall, the way I feel about the story and everything, it worked. But because of the whole Billy and Bailey situation, the whole run fell flat in my opinion. I enjoyed it originally, but it fell flat because of the fan resentment towards me coming back, because of the whole Billy and Bailey drama where I kind of got shoehorned into the situation that I was never involved in. So kind of people saw that as me being thrown into people's faces. And on top of that, some of the fans that are still watching, one of the biggest things and mistakes that we've ever done was talk to the fans. And I don't mean that in a dickish way, but they had like a lot of insight because of people like Billy and all this stuff. And that was just something I was very frustrated with. Unfortunately, like, no fan should be involved in all that. I know we did a video of me and Steven's feud history, and there was a huge bash of comments that happened because of Bailey and Billy. Like, ultimately, a lot of this stuff and my frustrations with this run led to everything that happened towards the end of season 2, unfortunately. So, because of the whole Bailey and Billy stuff and all that, it made me even more pissed off for when I wanted to return. So that's where Missionary 35 comes into play. So ultimately, it's a one-time thing for right now. I'll be involved. We'll do the Royal Rumble. The only reason why I did the Royal Rumble is because I would have loved to have one good performance, which was a good performance. I made it to the final 3, got 2 eliminations in the process, ultimately getting eliminated by Chris Reckless. And all right, that's a little nostalgia there. But then Missionary 37 comes around, and that is a complete different story. But before we get to that, we talk about me coming back again for Missionary 40. So by then, we did not decide that we were going to do me and George. I knew Steven wanted Brandon back, and he wanted to wrestle Brandon one more time. But the original plan was for Brandon and George to face for the Royal title, which made zero sense back then. But that was just a match because all Brandon wanted was to beat George. That's all it was. And plans got changed around. So Steven wanted to face Brandon. I honestly wanted to wrestle George. So the idea was to do that. But I also, at the same time, was like, I want to win one more championship. So I could say I've held at least a PGW championship. And the idea that I initially pitched to Steven was Final Judgment. Let's do an event before Missionary 40. And then ultimately, I can drop the title. And the guy that I thought about dropping the title to was George. And the only reason why I brought up George was because when you look at George and I, we've known each other our entire lives. We've had multiple matches against each other on camera. And I'm not saying it's because the videos were gone, but George and I never had a big-time one-on-one match. And I thought Missionary 40 at the time was a big show coming up. And I thought for George and I to be able to have, one match together with a big story, I think it would have done good for both George and I. Even adding a championship, I thought at the time was a good idea. And initially, my original idea with Steven was, what if I won the Warriors Championship? It was a new title, and, we can add some prestige to this thing with these type of stories. Now, ultimately, I would have only held the belt for like 2 weeks, but I thought, that'd be a nice little, title to have or whatnot. Steven didn't like the idea because he wanted to give it to Austin at the time, give him a record-breaking reign, which turned out to be very good to his favor, and that's what happened. So he pitched, what if we did the Intercontinental title? And I said, okay, I like that idea, but who do I face? So now we have this whole storyline of who's going to wrestle Scorpion at Final Judgment 3. So it's like Hunger Games with the Intercontinental title now, where it's like this whole 2 or 3 month story of who's going to wrestle Scorpion, who's it going to be? So you have 3 names that are, dropped. You have Mordecai, you have Zero Assault, and you have Leatherface, all fighting for months on end to determine who's going to wrestle Scorpion. So we teased that for so long, but I make my return to Missionary 37, in which I attack Leatherface and Zero Assault. I was pissed. Not at dumb necessarily, but I was pissed because, again, this all goes back to the fan resentment and all that because of the whole Billy and Bailey drama. I flat out shoot and call everybody on there like pieces of shit, and this is what you get. Like, that was a shoot. Like, that was me yelling as Josh on camera because I was pissed. I'm like, I want to be hated. I want to, I want to be resented. I want to be booed. And I was just very upset over how the full run went. So I kind of forced myself to be that pissed off on camera because of all that, where people saw it as a joke. But again, it was a joke because I was forcing my frustrations upon everybody. And we do the thing where George and Brandon would show up and we were going to attack them or something like that. But they both never showed up. So that even made me and Steven even more pissed off and to start shooting on them on screen and make the challenges for Missionary 40. But after Missionary 37 is when Billy goes into the channel and deletes all the videos of everything that we've worked on throughout the past 2 years. That made my stomach upset. Like I felt sick to my stomach thinking that Billy would do something like that after 2 years of us having fun in the Proving Grounds. It made me sick. And all Billy had to do was communicate, and he never did. He went out in this instance and decided to get onto the channel and start deleting every single thing, including all his matches and everything else like that. And we were all pissed and upset about it. Steven actually went to his house and actually fought his ass. That's how upset we all were. I actually, on my end, I posted a video after he did that, reposting the PP stop and all this stuff, saying, like, don't cross the boss and all that stuff. And then he makes a shoot video calling out, like, me, Steven, Chris. We were, like, he was going on a thing, and that's why Steven went over and, decided to go fight him. And it was a complete mess. And I think, personally, that made me even more angry going into this run, because it's like, now I can't watch any of my content. I barely have any content that I saved. I wanted to save my content, but I never got the chance to do so. And it made me even more inside be like, okay, I want to win a fucking title. I want to look like a main event star. I want to look like the old Prime Scorpion. Like, I want to be one of the top guys, even within the short amount of time we have left. Like, I had all these thoughts in my head where I just wanted everything. I was power hungry. I wanted to be like Triple H. Like, I wanted this reign of terror. I didn't care about anybody else back then. I was in it for myself because all my content is gone. So, like, how am I supposed to look back upon myself and be like, who was Scorpion? Scorpion was, an alright wrestler at CWA up until the end, where he was at his prime, but now I have nothing left. So I was basically the villain in everybody's story, because that was basically my villain origins. So that's where that came upon. And I still think to this day Billy's a fucking idiot for doing that. And he used me as a scapegoat to get away and blame me for being the reason why the videos were deleted. Now, Billy and I are on good terms now, and I wish him nothing but the best, but that was just a very nasty situation that happened that could have been easily avoided if all they had to do was Billy had to communicate, Steven had to communicate, 'cause a lot of that stuff had to do with Steven, dating back to the whole PP stomp. There was just a lot of animosity dating back to Missionary 28, and it just all boiled over just because someone was upset. Made no sense. So that's where my story comes into play with all that, unfortunately, which we get into No Holds Barred 15. So George, in script, breaks into my house. Meanwhile, I'm not there because I'm at the Proving Grounds for a match. Steven wanted to make this card big. And again, this is, I think, in my opinion, one of Steven's worst booking decisions was inserting me into a tag team match with him and pinning the world champion. I never asked for this match. I think Steven only wanted to do this match just because it was a big-time match to do. And I didn't really want to get physical at all in this match, so you can easily tell in the match where I don't really do much. And ultimately, Chris ends up being the legal man, and I'm the legal man, and ultimately, I end up pinning Chris. Chris at the time was the World Heavyweight Champion. So I basically just pinned in my first match the top guy in the PGW. And at the same time back then, I wasn't happy with Chris's push like many others. So I'm like, oh, sweet, I pinned the world champion. People are going to hate me now. So again, the match was completely unnecessary. There was no build, no story there. It was only done just because so there could be a big time match for that show. But that's where that came up to play. And then it's basically it did no favors for Ed and Chris. It really didn't. Ultimately, throughout this run, you can see like I have one up on Chris basically each time, which leads to Missionary 38, where we do the contract signings, which were supposed to be together, but again, Raven and George were unreliable back then, so we had to do each segment separate. And then Missionary 39 hits, where we do the tag match. In my opinion, I have nothing else to say, but it was the best tag team match in PGW history up to that point. And if it all ended there instead of 40, it would have been great. There would have been no issues. And then ultimately we get to the cash-in where Beers wins the world title. I'm the referee going into this and cost Chris. Made no sense at all to cost Chris again. I've cost him so many times. The U.S. title, the world title. Like, all this made no sense for Scorpion to be involved. And again, Chris kind of fell into the victimhood of, me and Beers, costed him, again, another championship. So we get to Final Judgment finally, and it's confirmed that it'll be Leatherface versus Scorpion in a dream match. Again, this all dates back from the whole Renaissance stuff. And ultimately, I end up winning the Intercontinental title. And honestly, I did not like this match at first. I really didn't. You can tell when it comes to this match, I took a step back compared to, Missionary 30 and me as the world champion back in 2016. I took a huge step back. You could tell. And I was not ready for it. I was gassed out. Like, you can tell that I was not physically ready and there. It was not one of my best performances, but ultimately I did win the match, and it did main event, because again, like the whole 30 argument where I talked about how Beers and I should have main evented, Again, there was no other match on the card that had the build as to, the 3 months as to who would face Scorpion. So that's one of the reasons why I did main event, even though I did not deserve it. So that happens, and then we do a segment which I personally didn't like. I didn't think made sense. It made Chris look weak again, looking back. And Chris was pretty upset about it. And the reason why I say that is it made him inferior to me, again. And number two, it's like he was a slave on camera. So the idea was to bloody up Ed and make Chris torture his own tag team partner. And what happened was, the one thing Chris told me not to do in this match, or not the match, the video, he told me to not hit him with the fiberglass stick. And I told him I wouldn't. And then I did. So that pushes it even further. And the only reason why I hit him with a fiberglass stick is you can hear Steven. I don't know if he meant that towards me or to Chris, but you can hear Steven saying, hit him. So I end up hitting Chris because I thought he was saying that to me. But I think it was towards Chris telling him to hit Ed. So I think I got confused, and ultimately I end up hitting Chris. And he was not happy about that at all. And then this is where all the overrated shit comes into play. And then we get to side matches. Yippee! So, ultimately, I'm like, I want to get at least a title defense under my belt before on this road to George. And ultimately, I was not going to lose. I basically said, fuck all you guys. I'm not going to lose a match until I lose to George. And once I lose to George, I'm more than happy to lose to anybody else. But ultimately, I only have one more match after George, and that would have been the Royal Rumble match. So, I said that. Chris, at the time, before all this stuff happened with the whole video deletions and all that, he wanted to wrestle me. But I told him, you can wrestle me, but you're not going to win. That was one of my biggest regrets of my career. Because, again, I wanted to look as strong as possible for the match with George, because I wanted to have George... I wanted George to be the George of old. I wanted it to be me being on a reign of terror and George back in like streak form, and it didn't work. So we get to a few matches. So the first match I have is with Shane at Zero Assault, and it was a good one of Shane's best matches up to that point. But he was arguably buried. I should say. He was arguably buried in this match, in my opinion, and it did him no favors at the end of the match. But otherwise, it was a good match. Second match is with Chris. This was the match that he asked for and he got, except I pushed hard for me to win, and I ultimately win. And the way to get around it was for Steven to get involved in a way where I can't remember how it happened. I think he like put my foot on the rope or something. I can't remember the whole thing of what happened. And I'm like, I could do this on my own and all this stuff. Like, I said all this stuff on camera to make myself look good. And again, it did Chris no favors. And the only reason why it was a 2 out of 3 falls match was so Chris could get at least a pinfall over me. Otherwise, it would have just been a singles match where, first of all, he gets to pin me, and then there's a double count out. That way I don't have to pin him or submit him twice. And then it was a good match. It was very underrated up till this point, and I still think it's very underrated. It was a good match, it was just the wrong winner. And looking back at it, instead of it being George, it should have been Chris in that spot, not George, where Chris ultimately beats me in Missionary 40 for the Intercontinental title. Looking back. Like, you could still do the match with George, just without the championship. And then you could still lose to George, but you can also lose to Chris. Or you could beat George, whatever works. So, that's where that happens. And then, ultimately, this match I had zero interest of doing. Zero interest. It was the second match with Leatherface. It was supposed to be against Akumu, but Steven stopped me last second saying, you're not beating Ed. And ultimately he pitched the idea of doing another match with Leatherface, and you could tell by the match I was not invested in it. It was a submission match that, honestly, I personally didn't care for. It's one of my worst matches just because it was one of those rare matches where I just did not invest in and didn't really trying, because after the match with Ed didn't happen, I'm just like, I didn't, like, screw this match. let's just get it out of the way. So that's where that match came out. So like I didn't care for the match or try much into it. Then we get to Missionary 40. Again, overall, the story for me and George was perfect. Just it didn't deserve that spot. But the first match we have is the infamous tag team match for the tag team titles. So I pushed hard over the months because, again, there's no other tag team outside of Chris and Ed. And I pitched to Steven, I want to be tag team champions because I've never held the tag team titles. It would be very nice to hold the tag team titles. I never had the initial, or I never had the, what's the best way to describe this? I never had the intention of wanting to win the tag team titles after I knew I was going to win the Intercontinental title. So it was basically like a two-man power trip, basically the whole Atonement run with me and Steven. So Steven has this ridiculous idea, which was a train wreck, and we would have 4 tag teams in this match. But instead of having the team being eliminated after one member's eliminated, both members have to be eliminated, which made it even worse. And starts out good with me and Nick. Fantastic. I was a bit nervous, but Nick and I practiced the opening sequence pretty good. But then I pedigree Austin. He kicks out. I hit him again. He doesn't kick out the second time. He walks out of the ring and throws a bitch fit. So this, my God. He leaves the ring and just like walks it all off. He thought I did not deserve that spot. And I didn't. I didn't deserve that spot. But my mindset back in the day, and I still feel this way a bit, is how much build did you do for your matches? How many times were you on camera? To my knowledge, if I remember correctly, Austin barely did any build going up to Missionary 40. Not many people did. So I thought back then I did enough build more than most of these people where I deserved all this stuff because I put in the effort. I put in the time. Whereas you only showed up one time or something like that up until Missionary 40 where your match did not have build with Ed up besides the 39 match. So, and again, I wasn't happy with Austin back in the day as well. I don't remember the whole story, but I think he either got expelled or I think he dropped out of high school. After he did that, I lost a lot of respect for Austin after that. And I did not like Austin after he did all that. Otherwise, before then, I enjoyed being around Austin. And him and I were pretty close and all that. I wouldn't say close, but we were good buds. But once he did all that, I'm like, are you fucking stupid? Like, you're just going to give up your life just to drop out of school just because you can't behave at school and get yourself into a lot of drama and all these situations? I'm like, yeah, dude, you're just, making mistake after mistake after mistake. That's how I felt about Austin back in the day. And I did not like that at all. Then I almost break my arm in the match. There was a spot where my arm's not in the right place for a suplex and Ed hits it and my arm gets caught somewhere and I lose feeling in my arm completely. I thought I broke my arm. I temporarily lose some of my feel in my arm where I can't put my arm up. And then ultimately Greg hits the roll of dice on Steven, and I break it up. Steven was not going to kick out, but I didn't realize that. And I also knew if I did not break it up and I was the last person in the ring to end the match, that would have been much worse than if it was just to both of us. So I break it up, he hits the roll of dice on me, and ultimately I end up winning the tag team titles. This, in my opinion, is the 3rd worst match of my career, if I remember correctly, outside of the tag match with the Masked Militia, which we'll get into later on, and the match with Joe. It was one of my worst matches. And no one looked good in it. It did nobody any favors other than satisfaction for what I wanted, and that was to be tag team champions. Nobody else was happy but me. Steven didn't want to win the tag team titles, but I did. So I basically said to everybody, I'm winning these titles because I want to. I put in the time, I put in the effort. That's my mindset from back then. I'm not saying that's how I felt back then, but I look back at it now, and I still feel that way, but not to that extent. I still think Steven and I should have won a match because we were like the only other tag team besides Chris and Ed. But like otherwise, like why would you want to put the tag titles like on the Block Brothers? Like they weren't back that long. Or why would you want to give them to Nick and Greg, then shoehorn them into this match. Like, I mean, honestly, looking back at it, you probably should have just had Chris and Ed as the final tag team champions, but again, I refuse to lose. And then ultimately, we get to me and George's match. This match, in my opinion, is nothing but self-satisfaction. It's nothing but self-satisfaction. I look at it as if it's like SpongeBob and Patrick, where, you know, the episode where they're wrestling on a hamburger in one of the SpongeBob episodes, and then at the end they're like, oh, I hate you, I don't like you, and then at the end of it, it's like, you do care. That's basically what this was. It was nothing but self-satisfaction for me and George to get that moment, to get that one big-time match against each other. That's all it was. The match was average at best, but it did no favors in terms of where it was placed in the main event. And honestly, a lot of these matches flopped on this day, but I think out of all those matches, I think this was the best one of all of them, because again, like, Beavers and Raven wasn't that great. Bailey and Nick, honestly, was, in my opinion, Nick sabotaging the match. You know, like, a lot of these matches, or big-time matches, outside of the Nick and Greg match, weren't that good. And the HFW, or not the HFW, the HWL Fatal 5-Way was good, but the problem was everybody on the roster was very pissy about it, because they're like, oh, these members of the roster, they haven't been around, but they pulled a good match. We were all jealous. And that's why we didn't like the match. It's a good match now, but we were all very jealous back in the day. You could just tell. And then ultimately, the Royal Rumble match, which, again, Missionary 40 overall, including this match. Excuse me, I got a runny nose. Overall, when you have every member of the roster from past, present, and future, and you have all these top stars, you get the train wreck that is the Missionary 40 Royal Rumble. I indirectly pitched the idea during a Storytime episode with George, be like, everybody deserves that last match, you know, and that's kind of why this match happened. And ultimately, with all that members of the roster and all their all the egos, it's the train wreck that is Missionary 40's Royal Rumble. So unfortunately, a lot of stuff that happened in the match did not happen. Well, let's start out with the first part. Shane fucked up. Shane absolutely fucked up. And this kind of was the start of the whole train wreck. So what happened was Shane misplaced my number with, I believe, someone else, because I wasn't supposed to come in earlier or whatnot. So that happens. And actually, it might have been George who got... Someone's numbers got misplaced. Like, Shane messed up the entrance order. So ultimately, I end up in the ring with, I think, Ed and Josh at the time. And I get an elimination from, you know, I eliminate Leatherface because I get told to eliminate him. Or he tells me to eliminate him. And that happens. But then, next what comes up is George comes out. And I call, in my opinion, this is the worst audible in my career. I just say, fuck it. It's all three members of the Enlightenment. Let's go after these guys. So we unfortunately go after Josh and kind of like almost kill him in the middle of the ring. It was brutal. It was unsafe. That was uncalled for on my part because, again, George did not like, you know, the HWL guys. I call an audible that I thought was a cool idea. Complete train wreck. I just went along with it just because, you know, everybody looks at me as a ring leader. So everybody just went along with this idea of mine, and it just turned into complete shit. So Josh gets nearly hurt because of my selfish idea. And then Daniel comes out. And then I had no intentions of doing that whole, you know, mosh pit attack thing like what we did with Josh. But I think Daniel knew, because it was just the three of us in the ring, that he was kind of fucked. So he just kind of self-eliminated himself. And our body language kind of went towards, we're going to attack him, even though I didn't have intention of doing that. So once he did that, I knew this was pretty bad. And then that's ultimately where the story comes up, where Nathan's next. And Daniel tells Nathan to eliminate himself, which I knew once he got in the ring, I'm like, I knew he was going to do that. I'm like, I'm going to at least put my hands on him. That way, there's not another self-elimination. So that's why that happened. So I end up with 2 eliminations there. And then next up, I believe, was the Stalker. So yeah, I think, yeah, I can't remember I would have to look back at the match, the entry order. But the Stalker comes out, we eliminate him there, the three of us, and then now here's the part where George fucks up. So the idea was for me and Steven as Beers to eliminate George the Butcher, with me getting thrown from behind by Beers. It still happened, but with Anubis. So he was the next one that came out, so I got another elimination, which would be then 5 eliminations by me. Only because, George got himself eliminated. He didn't follow through with the script. So that's what happened. So overall, we killed the momentum of the match to start the enlightenment thing. We made no sense. It buried the HWL guys. And I know I'm going to get a lot of hate for saying this, but I have no sympathy for Carter Woods. I really don't. And I'm not saying that from back in the day because of, getting along with him and all this stuff. It all has to do with my personal feelings towards him, which will be talked about later on, about how he treated me after my dad passed away. So looking back at that compared to this, I have no sympathy for Josh. Otherwise, I could feel for, Daniel, Nathan, because overall I got 5 eliminations, 4 more than I didn't deserve. I should have just had the one with Leatherface and George, but it just turned into, a complete train wreck. And ultimately, Austin gets buried by Diablo after he gets in. Bailey gets punted in the head by Ed because he won't let go of Chris. Steven wanted the most eliminations. Ed wanted to be number 1, which was another factor because Ed was not supposed to be involved until later on in the match. So Ed wanted to be number 1, and the condition of that was if Steven gets the most eliminations. So, the whole thing was just a complete egotistical train wreck. And it's honestly the worst match of all time outside of the Blaze and Terror match. So I'm not going to go more depth into Missionary 40 anymore because of all that stuff. But I got blamed overall for 40 failing, which I completely get based off how this run went. And again, it was just a lot of frustrations dating back, like I said, to Missionary 28. I wish I could redo all that over again because it was just not a good time for me, period. With me, losing all that content, wanting self-fulfillment with George. Even Brandon got him, a main event, match with Steven and all that. So you can argue, Raymond got self-fulfillment also because he got what he wanted, and that was a royal title win. So that's that. But I got blamed for everything that happened. But overall, I do deserve all the blame. Excuse me. I do deserve all the blame for the most part because I initiated all this. And if I kept my ego in check, it wouldn't have happened. But again, with me being frustrated for so long, it's just that, I was pissed. I wanted what I wanted. I didn't care what anybody else wanted. It was just very selfish of me. And outside of winning the tag team titles and not having any sympathy for Josh, it's just I should have been more selfless. I should have been more understanding. I should have been more caring, especially with that Josh elimination. I should have thought about everybody else also first because, again, I was a part-timer. I did not deserve all this stuff. It was just a complete disaster, and I have no one to blame but myself. But at the same time, everybody else has to take accountability with how they performed. Like I mentioned, Nick with the whole sabotaging thing and, how Austin was unprofessional in a tag. There was just a lot that went wrong, or that could have went good, but went wrong because we had a complete roster of everybody. And when everybody's egos are all together, you get what is Missionary 40. So I'm not going to talk about anything else about Missionary 40 just because we all know the rest of what happened. But again, it was the best thing to happen because look where we ended up now. It lasted 6 more years, or technically 7 more years. And it was the best thing to happen to PGW because nobody wanted PGW to end. It was forced. The mentality was me, Steven, Brandon, and George. We were all graduating. And once we graduated, we're like, haha, we graduated. This is the end. Our childhood. Which is ironic because that was kind of how my match with George turned out to be, in terms of story. It was the end of childhood. And we basically said, we're graduating. You're all done wrestling. We're all moving on, which made no sense because that was very selfish between the four of us, thinking that we had to end PGW just because we graduated high school. There was so much more left in the tank, and I'm so glad we realized this um, earlier than we could have said, because, we could have ended and then came back like 3 or 4 years later. But no, we realized we made the mistake and ultimately came back for Missionary 41, which leads to Missionary 41. So my reputation is destroyed, and deservedly so. So I'm initially pitched the offer to wrestle Missionary 41, and the plan was for me to wrestle Daniel and lose to Daniel. And I don't remember if there was a plan for me to wrestle Chris and lose to him as well. I was basically going to get punished. It's basically what it was. And I deserved it. I most certainly did. But I turned down the offer before I was given a deadline. I declined around March. And my original reasoning behind it was I was still bitter. I was still bitter about Missionary 40. I didn't think anybody would want to see me on camera. It's still too fresh in people's minds. And I still had the mindset that we had to grow the fuck up. Like, we graduated school. Why should I be wrestling? I'm an adult now. I gotta grow the fuck up. But I still loved professional wrestling. And I don't know why I thought that way. But again, that was another selfish moment of mine, which I should have accepted the offer and did the match with Daniel. Because again, that's one of the things I regret, is I wish I had that one last match with Daniel. And I think with me being in my peak there, or close to it again, and having that technical match and doing all that crazy stuff with Daniel, I think we could have blew the house down with a second match compared to Final Judgment. It was a missed opportunity. And there were multiple opportunities, which we'll talk about later on, of doing this match. It's just that, stuff it just did not work out. So I wish we did the match. It's just stuff happened, which leads to May 13th. So this is where it takes a dark turn, unfortunately. And this is kind of where we get towards the end of this episode. So May 13th, 2018 was probably the worst day of my life. So I get a phone call around, or not a phone call. I get abruptly woken up by my sister around 8:30 in the morning. It might have been 9 o'clock in the morning. And once this happens, she's yelling that Dad's missing. And they don't know where he is. And then a few minutes after I woke up, they kind of found the car. And they found that he took my car, which was a Jeep, because I still had my permit at the time. And they could not find him. Like, the car was still running. It was running for at least 2 hours. Ultimately, we get the news from my granddad, because he came up our driveway, and we asked, did they find him? And they said, yeah. And they said, he's gone. So that it hurt. It really did. It's like my heart like sunk, and like it's just like I felt like I felt useless. I just feel like I could have done a lot more to help my dad of what he was going through, but at the time I didn't know about our family history. When it comes to my family history, and I had to learn this the hard way. So what happened was there was a suicide history in my family, and I had to learn this the hard way. Between my granddad and my great-grandfather, I was the only person in my family that did not know about this, just because I think of the autism and how I would react and all this stuff. But basically what happened was my dad lost his job back in March of 2018, and he never recovered. I think he was going through financial stuff where he felt like we were losing money, and he was a complete mess. And I think a lot of it has to stem with his dad, or my granddad, because again, he was a complete mess. There was a story And this, I think, was the last time that my cousin Steven actually saw my dad. And my brother backed his car into a mailbox and whatnot. My dad yelled "motherfucker" and started crying. Like, there was a lot that went on that happened within those 3 or 4 months. And there was a time my dad barged into my bedroom, and he grabs me, and just, he's holding me tight and just starts hugging me, tackles me on my bed, and starts telling me that he's sorry and he wishes he could be a better father. Like he wishes he could have been a better dad. And it really hurt because it bothered me because I felt like I could have done more, like I said. But my dad was a mental train wreck. Like, he didn't want any help. Like, he didn't want to see a counselor. He didn't want to go to therapy. It was bad. But ultimately, we found out that my dad, he walked approximately around 250 to 275 feet away from a road towards the woods near my house at the time. And he took one of his hunting guns, one of those turkey guns that you'd use for hunting. And ultimately, he shoots himself in the chest. Instantly kills him. It destroyed me. And I knew after that happened, because my dad was only 49 years old, and I knew once that happened, I was done for 41. I was not mentally going to be able to, wrestle, even if I wanted to. So that's kind of where my real reasoning as to why I didn't compete. It was a very rough time for me, and I have no one to blame for all this. I learned a lot from it, and the people that were there for me helped me a lot. George especially, because again, George went through this with his dad, with him ODing and all that in 2014. And whenever we went through this 4 years later, back in 2018, on Mother's Day, out of all things, which I couldn't imagine what my mom felt. He was there for me whenever, he was there for me when I most needed it. And the day he came to the house that morning, when everything happened, that's when I finally broke. I literally, I could not let go of George. It was very emotional. And then the viewing and the funeral and stuff happened. I knew whenever Steven came down, I hugged him. I did not let go for at least 2 minutes. It was something that I had to, learn to fight through for me, be there for my family. Because again, losing your dad at this young of an age, losing your dad at 19, it's absolutely brutal. And then a lot happened towards, 41. So, ultimately, I'm ruled out for 41 because of all this stuff, because my dad committed suicide via gunshot wound, and I basically said, I'm not going to be at 41. I'm not going to go. And then this even pushes me back more because of the Sons of Vengeance. So, unfortunately, there were videos, which I will talk about in the next episode, that pushed me even further away and made me more upset, which is one of the reasons why I'm not really friends with Daniel anymore, though we are mutual. There are things that happen with the Sons of Vengeance that ultimately destroy my relationship with Daniel. And it all stems from my dad passing away, which is something that I will go into to start the next episode. So that was a bit emotional to talk about, but this is where the episode ends, where I will start off in the next episode of why I still didn't show up because of the Sons of Vengeance and Daniel, and why my relationship with Daniel fell apart. It all has to stem with my dad passing away and all that stuff, because a lot happened around that time period where there were people, in my opinion, that I really needed the most and I thought would be there to support me. And it just, to me, I thought, in my opinion, a lot of them, on the roster at the time, because they were still frustrated with 40 and all that stuff, I think they looked at it as a joke. And that's kind of where we stop to discuss in the next episode of why my relationship with Daniel failed past this. And it never recovered. So that's where we'll start in the next episode. From there and go up to Missionary 50, where I basically atone for my sins. So I hope you guys watched that. I know that was a little bit emotional there, but again, lots of controversies from 30 and 40 and all that. And hopefully you guys enjoyed the next episode. So thank you guys for watching and being understanding.